Welcome back. You are listening to the Crazy Horse Chronicles team. We are so thrilled to have you with us today as we launch into this special deep dive
Really excited for this one, yeah.
because our mission for this broadcast is to serve as a long-form background expansion for our Far West Dime novel broadcast.
Right, which we know you guys have been asking for.
Yeah, exactly. And, when most people picture the Battle of the Little Bighorn, they see this highly romanticized, almost cinematic painting, right? You have the golden-haired commander standing on a dusty hill, sword in hand.
Surrounded by thousands of warriors.
Yes, in this sudden, totally unpredictable clash of fate.
Yeah, it's largely remembered as this chaotic accident of history, like a sudden violent storm on the plains that nobody could have predicted.
But when you actually peel back the layers, the historical record, you realize it wasn't a sudden storm at all.
Not even close.
It was a slow-moving train wreck, a disaster engineered in the bureaucratic offices of Washington, D.C., and then, compounded by staggering logistical failures.
And sealed by shocking communication breakdowns. I mean, the defeat at the Little Bighorn wasn't just a tactical loss on the battlefield. It was the absolute inevitable culmination of cascading structural backstories and thematic miscalculations.
Every single domino was meticulously set up to fall long before the first shot was fired.
Exactly.
And that is exactly the chain reaction we are getting into today. But real quick, before we dive in, our sources require us to wade into the bitter 19th century politics of the era.
Oh, yeah, and just as a quick note to you listening, we're acting purely as historical messengers today.
Right, we aren't endorsing any 1870s political platform.
Left, right, center, none of it. We're simply looking at how these fierce partisan divides between conservative Democrats and radical Republicans after the Civil War actually dictated battlefield decisions.
Yeah, we are impartially laying out the facts of the historical record, because to understand how the 7th Cavalry ended up fighting for their lives at the Little Bighorn, we have to start almost 2,000 miles away from the battlefield.
Yeah, way far away.
In Washington, D.C., looking at a man whose career was completely unraveling.
We are talking, of course, about George Armstrong Custer, the quote-unquote boy general of the Civil War. By the spring of 1876, his reputation was totally on the line.
And he had locked himself into this intense, highly public feud with the President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant.
Right, so Custer, who identified as a conservative Democrat, had been a thorn in the side of the Republican establishment for quite a while.
He'd actively opposed Reconstruction policies.
Right, he had, yeah. Even going over Grant's head to avoid commanding an all-black regiment earlier in his career.
Wow.
But the real boiling point happens right as the Army is preparing this massive campaign against the Sioux and Cheyenne. We get hit with the Belknap post-traitor scandal.
Okay, yes, the Belknap scandal. To understand the sheer scale of this thing, you have to look at how military outposts function, right?
Yeah, so Secretary of War William Belknap was running a massive, highly lucrative kickback scheme.
Yeah.
He was granting monopoly rights to military trading posts at these frontier forts.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that for a second, because, how did a trading post monopoly actually impact the soldiers on the ground?
Tremendously. Look at it this way. When a trader holds an absolute monopoly at an isolated frontier fort, there's no competition.
Yes.
None.
Right.
So they can price gouge the soldiers for everything, from basic supplies to supplementary food and clothing. The soldiers, whose pay was already meager, were just being bled dry.
And the kickbacks from those inflated prices were flowing straight back to Secretary Belknap in Washington.
Exactly. But here is where the tragedy of the era really sharpens into focus, and that is the weapons.
Yes, the rifle situation. This is just staggering to read about.
It really is. While the soldiers were being issued these Springfield Model 1873 breech-loading rifles, the native tribes were legally taking their buffalo robes and pelts to those very same trading posts.
The same exact one.
The exact same ones, selling them for cash and purchasing far superior firearms.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Because I understand that government procurement can be notoriously cheap, but why were the Army's rifles so bad? And what made the native warriors' weapons superior?
Well, it basically comes down to metallurgy and mechanics. The Army's Springfield rifles use copper cartridges. So in the heat of a chaotic, rapid-fire engagement, the breech of the rifle would get blazing hot.
Right, makes sense.
And that heat caused the cheap copper casing to expand and literally fuse to the inside of the chamber.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Soldiers literally had to stop shooting, pull out their knives, and pry the jammed casing out of the gun before they could reload.
While under fire.
Meanwhile, the native warriors were buying Winchester repeating rifles. These used lever-action mechanics and brass cartridges, which didn't expand the same way.
So they aren't jamming.
Right. A warrior with a Winchester could lay down a devastating wall of continuous fire, while a cavalryman was frantically digging at his jammed rifle with a pocket knife.
So just to recap, the very trading posts exploiting the soldiers are arming the people they are about to go to war with.
Exactly.
So Congress launches an investigation. A Democrat-controlled committee calls Custer back to Washington to testify. And Custer just unloads.
Oh, he completely unloads. He provides hours of incredibly damaging testimony.
But the issue is that almost all of Custer's testimony was pure hearsay, wasn't it?
It was. He couldn't actually prove the bribes. He had no hard documents, but he threw all the accusations out there anyway.
Just burning bridges.
Yeah. And in the process, he implicated not just Secretary Belknap, but President Grant's own brother, Orville Grant.
Oof.
And to make matters worse, while Custer was in D.C., he was highly visible, socializing and lunching with Democratic congressional leaders who were actively trying to ruin Grant's administration.
I mean, the partisan maneuvering was just blatant. And President Grant, who was a fiercely loyal man, was infuriated.
Beyond furious. He refused to even see Custer. He left the famed boy general sitting on a bench outside his office for days.
Oh, wow, just icing him out.
Yeah, and then Grant dropped the hammer. He stripped Custer of his command of the Dakota Column.
And we should clarify what the Dakota Column was for you listening. This wasn't just a small regiment, right?
No, it was a massive, multi-regiment expeditionary force representing the primary thrust of the upcoming summer campaign. Grant basically told Custer he wasn't going to be allowed to go on the campaign at all.
Which, for a military man whose entire public identity was built on glory and action, being the vanguard.
This was a devastating, career-ending blow.
I really want you to imagine this mindset. It's like, think of a disgraced corporate executive who has completely alienated the CEO and the board. He knows he's on the chopping block.
Right.
He knows his reputation is in ruins. And he knows that the absolute only way to save his career and his legacy is to go out into the field and secure a massive, high-risk, exclusive victory.
He has to prove to the board that he is utterly indispensable. So take that corporate executive, but put him in a cavalry uniform, armed with a carbine, and strip away all his backup. That executive isn't just anxious, he's existentially threatened.
Yeah, totally cornered.
It was only through the desperate, frantic intercession of his superiors, Generals Alfred Terry and Philip Sheridan, that Grant finally relented. But Custer was heavily demoted.
He was allowed to lead only his own regiment, the 7th Cavalry, and he would be strictly under General Terry's overarching command.
Which means this political crucible fundamentally transformed Custer. He left Washington, D.C. not as the confident, calculating commander he had been in the Civil War.
He left as a desperate man obsessively chasing a redemptive solo victory.
And we really have to view every single decision he makes from this point forward through that lens of desperation.
Absolutely. Which brings us to the operational reality awaiting him. Driven by this political desperation, Custer is thrust into a military campaign that is already fundamentally flawed on a logistical level.
Yes, the logistical machine.
Let's look at the failure of the winter campaign that preceded this whole summer offensive. General Philip Sheridan, commanding the military division of the Missouri, initially believed that winter weather would be the ultimate weapon against the native camps.
Right. He thought deep snow would trap the villages, immobilize their pony herds, and just make them easy targets for a winter cavalry strike.
Which, I mean, on paper, the logic sort of holds.
On paper, sure. In reality, it was a frozen nightmare. In March of 1876, General George Crook led a column out into bitter sub-zero temperatures. One of his commanders, Colonel Reynolds, managed to attack a Cheyenne and Oglala village on the Powder River.
But the weather didn't just immobilize the Native Americans. It destroyed the soldiers.
Precisely. The soldiers initially took the village, but the native warriors secured the high ground and launched a fierce, sustained counterattack. Reynolds had to execute a hasty, highly disorganized retreat.
Just a total mess.
Yeah, the army suffered from severe starvation and frostbite, and they ended up leaving dead and severely wounded soldiers behind in the snow.
Which is a massive blow to morale.
Huge. Instead of breaking the Native Americans' resolve, the failed winter strike just proved the army was vulnerable, making the tribes more openly defiant.
So the army abandons the winter strategy entirely, and they pivot to a massive, lumbering summer offensive. The new plan is this three-pronged convergence.
Right.
You have General Terry, along with Custer marching west from the Dakota Territory. You have Colonel Gibbon marching east from Montana. And you have General Crook marching north from Wyoming.
And they are converging on a largely unmapped region of about 100,000 square miles. The valleys of the Powder, Tongue, Rosebud, and Bighorn rivers.
100,000 square miles. Unmapped.
Yeah. And here is the crucial, baffling detail of this logistical machine. Sheridan gave absolutely no specific tactical instructions to these three commanders.
Wait, okay, I have to push back on this. You're telling me they're sending three completely separate armies into a 100,000 square mile wilderness, and the Supreme Commander doesn't have a specific plan for how they actually link up?
Literally no plan for how they connect.
It's like trying to coordinate three blindfolded giants in a massive forest without any radios. I mean, how could they possibly synchronize a trap?
It sounds utterly absurd to modern ears. But we have to look at the institutional arrogance of the 19th century U.S. Army.
They just thought they'd win no matter what.
Exactly. Sheridan explicitly stated in his communications that he thought it would be, quote-unquote, unwise to make any combinations in such difficult country. He believed each column was strong enough to take care of itself.
Wow.
The entire strategy was essentially hoping that one column would accidentally flush the native forces out and push them directly into the path of another column.
So the whole strategy relied entirely on the assumption that the enemy would just run away.
Completely. The military leadership was suffering from a massive institutional blind spot. They were singularly terrified that the Native Americans would scatter and melt into the landscape before a decisive battle could be fought.
The possibility that the military might actually be outmatched, or that the disparate tribes would unify into a massive coalition and actively stand their ground.
It wasn't even factored into the equation.
Yeah.
Not even a passing thought.
And that assumption that the blindfolded giants would just bump into a fleeing enemy is exactly what set up the disaster a few days later, miles away at the Rosebud.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the plan predictably falls completely apart when one of those giants walks directly into a unified, highly motivated enemy that has decided to fight.
This brings us to June 17th. General Crook's southern column, about 1,000 soldiers, plus nearly 300 Crow and Shoshone scouts, is resting near Rosebud Creek.
And Crook feels secure, right?
Oh, he feels so secure, assuming the native forces are running from him, that he has his men completely relaxed. I mean, they've even taken the bridles out of their horses' mouths to let them graze.
Unbelievable. And suddenly, the horizon darkens. Crazy Horse arrives with a combined force of about 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. They aggressively surprise Crook.
Yeah.
And reading the sources, this wasn't the typical hit-and-run skirmish tactic the Army was used to dealing with.
Not at all. This was a total revelation in frontier warfare. Under Crazy Horse's leadership, the native forces didn't just take potshots and scatter. They fought a brilliant, fluid, 6-hour pitched battle.
What does that actually look like on the ground, though? I mean, what makes a battle fluid compared to what the cavalry was actually trained for?
Well, the U.S. Army was trained in linear tactics, right? Form a skirmish line, lay down suppressing fire, advance systematically.
Standard European-style warfare.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Crazy Horse completely broke that paradigm. He broke down traditional tribal fighting lines and coordinated smaller, highly mobile bands of warriors.
Oh, wow.
They would aggressively attack a section of Crook's line, feign a retreat to draw the hot-blooded cavalrymen out of their defensive formation.
Lure them out.
Yeah, lure them out. And once the soldiers were isolated, other hidden bands would sweep in and surround them. They darted through the dust and smoke, holding the field, retreating when necessary, striking back hard.
It wasn't a skirmish. It was a meat grinder.
It really was. The only thing that saved Crook from being entirely overrun was the fierce, desperate counterattack of his Crow and Shoshone scouts.
It's just an incredible battle. Crook technically survives, but he's completely fought out. He's bloodied, his ammunition is totally depleted, and he's burdened with scores of wounded men.
So what does he do? He retreats.
He pulls his entire column back to his base camp at Goose Creek in Wyoming to basically lick his wounds. The southern prong of the attack is entirely knocked out of Sheridan's great pincer movement.
Yep. And this leads to what might be the single most devastating error of the entire campaign. Crook retreats, but he completely fails to send messengers north to warn General Terry, Colonel Gibbon, or Custer about what just happened.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Let's be fair to Crook.
Okay.
If he has just barely survived a massive 6-hour battle, he has critically wounded men moaning in wagons, he is low on supplies, and he is deep in hostile territory, isn't his primary directive to save his remaining men? I mean, could he realistically even spare a messenger to ride hundreds of miles north through an area he knows is just swarming with warriors?
It is a fair question, but military historians almost universally condemn Crook for this. Yes, preserving his command was vital, but he had hundreds of allied Crow and Shoshone scouts.
Right.
These were masters of traversing that exact terrain, undetected. Sending a few riders north to establish contact was standard operating procedure.
So why didn't he?
Well, Crook claimed the Battle of the Rosebud was a victory because he nominally held the field at the end of the day.
Typical.
Right. But his failure to communicate was highly likely driven by ego. He didn't want to admit to the other commanders that he had been battered into a retreat.
The negligence is staggering. You have a seasoned commander who has just been fought to a standstill by a massive unified native army that did exactly the opposite of what the U.S. Army assumed they would do.
They didn't run, they fought.
They fought, and he leaves his allies completely in the dark.
By failing to communicate, Crook created a fatal intelligence gap. By stopping the Gray Fox, which was the native name for Crook Crazy Horse, didn't just win a tactical engagement.
He neutralized a full third of the U.S. forces.
Exactly. And he ensured the remaining columns would march into the valley of the Little Bighorn completely blind.
Terry and Custer are marching right into the heart of this territory, totally unaware that the trap is already broken. Operating in this deadly intelligence vacuum, the remaining commanders gather to finalize their plan.
And this brings us to the evening of June 21st, 1876.
The culmination on the far west. They meet in the cabin of the steamboat Far West, which is moored at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Rosebud rivers.
Yeah, the famous meeting.
I really want to set the scene for you listening. The Far West is this 190-foot riverboat, drafting only 20 inches of water, basically serving as a floating supply base for the Army. Sitting in that cramped wooden cabin are General Terry, Colonel Gibbon, and Lieutenant Colonel George Custer. The air is thick with cigar smoke. They are looking over an outdated, highly inaccurate map, making life and death plans based entirely on false assumptions.
The institutional hubris in that cabin was just suffocating. Their fatal consensus was twofold.
Okay.
First, they firmly believed they were dealing with only a few hundred warriors, maybe 800 at the absolute most. They had no idea that thousands of agency Native Americans had slipped away in the spring to join Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse.
Right, because nobody had seen them.
Exactly. Second, based on years of previous smaller skirmishes, they believed with absolute certainty that the default behavior of those warriors would be to scatter and flee into the mountains the second they saw soldiers.
Because they have no idea what happened to Crook 4 days earlier at the Rosebud.
Exactly. So Terry devises a pincer movement of his own. Gibbon will march his slower infantry back up the Yellowstone and come down the Bighorn River from the north. Custer will take his 7th Cavalry, swing wide south down the Rosebud, and essentially act as an anvil, pushing the Indians north into Gibbon's waiting forces.
So Terry's written orders to Custer the next morning outline this plan. He explicitly wanted Custer to wait, to pace his march, so that Gibbon's slower infantry could get into position by June 26th.
Yes. But crucially, Terry included a discretionary loophole.
The loophole?
He wrote that Custer should conform to these views unless he saw, quote, sufficient reason for departing from them.
And if there is one thing you never give a politically desperate, glory-hungry commander who is trying to single-handedly save his career, it is a discretionary loophole.
It's literally the worst thing you could do.
So Custer takes the 7th Cavalry and heads out. By June 24th, his scouts find a massive trail left at the native encampment. The Crow and Arikara scouts warn Custer that the trail indicates a massive number of Indians, far more than they expected.
But Custer brushes them off.
Completely ignores them.
His only fear, the exact same fear that dominated the meeting on the far west, is that the Indians will spot them and escape before he can strike his redeeming blow.
So he pushes his men hard. We're talking brutal 30-mile-a-day marches in the sweltering late June heat.
Yeah.
I really want you to put yourself in the saddle here to understand the physical toll. Imagine riding for days through blinding, choking dust. The sun is beating down on you, your canteens are running dry, and the alkali dust is just coating your throat.
Your horse is blowing out, trembling from exhaustion.
You are severely sleep-deprived, maybe even hallucinating from the sheer fatigue.
It is a recipe for total physical and mental collapse. And then, on the morning of June 25th, Custer gets word that his column has been spotted by native scouts.
The panic sets in. In Custer's desperate mind, his worst nightmare is realizing the element of surprise is gone.
Right.
If he waits for Gibbon's infantry on the 26th, he assumes the village will scatter. His chance for that massive, solo, redemptive victory will vanish into the hills, and he will return to Washington in absolute disgrace.
So, utilizing Terry's discretionary loophole, he decides to attack immediately.
Without hesitation.
He drives his exhausted, sleep-deprived 7th Cavalry without waiting to properly ascertain the size or exact location of the enemy straight toward the Little Bighorn.
Straight into it.
He splits his command into 3 battalions, which, was a tactic he used successfully years prior at the Washita.
All right.
But here, against an unprecedented encampment of perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 warriors who are highly motivated and ready to fight.
It was an absolute death sentence.
It was.
And we all know the tragic result. Custer and 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry are entirely wiped out. Major Reno and Captain Benteen are pinned down on the bluffs, fighting for survival for 2 agonizing days until Terry and Gibbon finally arrive to relieve them.
Yeah, and when we synthesize all of this source material, the picture is incredibly clear.
It really is.
The tragedy of the Little Bighorn wasn't just a product of Custer's ego or rashness on the final day of the battle. It was the result of an entire chain of command crippled from top to bottom.
It was poisoned by the political infighting and desperation of the Belknap scandal.
It was blinded by the logistical failures of Sheridan's uncoordinated campaign.
Doomed by Crook's communication failure at the Rosebud.
And it was ultimately destroyed by an arrogant, institutional underestimation of indigenous military power, tactics, and unity.
A slow-moving train wreck, where literally every single switch on the track was flipped in the wrong direction. The political crucible, the logistical nightmare, the Rosebud failure, and the hubris on the far west, they perfectly aligned to create this historic disaster.
Which leaves us with a fascinating, almost haunting hypothetical to consider.
Oh, lay it on us.
Think about the very first domino. If Custer hadn't alienated President Grant with his partisan hearsay testimony, he wouldn't have been stripped of his overarching command.
Right.
He would have been commanding the entire Dakota column alongside Terry, rather than acting as a rogue vanguard desperate to salvage his career with a solo victory.
Man, that changes the entire psychological landscape of the campaign.
It really does. Would a slower, more coordinated approach by a secure, confident Custer have changed history? Or, and this is the really provocative question, was the sheer size, the unprecedented unity, and the tactical brilliance of the native encampment on the Greasy Grass, which is the indigenous name for the Little Bighorn,
Yeah.
was it destined to overwhelm any 19th century military doctrine thrown at it, no matter who was in charge?
That is a phenomenal question for you to mull over. Would coordination have actually mattered against a force that size? Or was the U.S. Army simply outmatched by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull's alliance that summer?
Yeah. Something to really think about.
Definitely. Think on the mechanics, the hubris, and the politics of this disaster as you dive into our upcoming Far West dime novel broadcast. Thank you so much for joining us for this special background expansion.
Thanks, everyone.
We love unpacking these deep, complex moments in history with you. From the Crazy Horse Chronicles team, thank you for listening and keep exploring the past.